So, welcome to our two-part webinar series on trauma-informed practice for service providers working with refugee claimants. Our first webinar took place on January 28th, and this is part two of the series. I'm joining you from the unceded traditional territory of the Coquitlam First Nation, which lies within the shared territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Musqueam, Cookite, Squamish, and Stolo nations. It's important for me to acknowledge the lands that I am privileged to live, work, and raise my children on as a way of showing respect and honoring the Indigenous peoples of these lands. Acknowledgement for me is a simple way of resisting the erasure of Indigenous histories and working towards honoring and inviting the truth. ISSOBC's BC Refugee Hub would like to gratefully acknowledge the funding for this project from the province of British Columbia through the Ministry of Post-Secondary Education and Future Skills. Thank you to the province of BC for your support. So, part two, which is the session you're in now, is on addressing emotional challenges during uncertainty. Okay, so for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, I'll just give you a little brief introduction on the BC Refugee Hub. The BC Refugee Hub started in November of 2015 with the arrival of Syrian refugee families to assist and empower individuals and refugee serving organizations to help in the resettlement process. ISSBC, in partnership with the province of British Columbia, created this online resource hub called the BC Refugee Hub. The hub provides timely information about refugees arriving to British Columbia, the latest reports, publications, statistics, fact sheets, and we have a resource center with a variety of information from service providers. We also highlight the stories of refugees and refugee claimants with lived experience through short videos and storytelling. We also hold capacity building, online and in-person workshops and webinar training sessions like this one on a variety of topics relating to refugees and refugee claimants. Currently, our focus is on supporting those who are working with and supporting refugee claimants. We also promote the services and programs of various organizations across British Columbia in our weekly updates on the hub and in our monthly e-newsletter. For this year, we already launched a survey, feedback survey about the BC Refugee Hub. We also launched a service directory for BC Safe Haven service providers, and that is to help with referrals. It includes all of the BC Safe Haven funded organizations and the types of services that they offer, and provides contact information in case you need to refer a client to a BC Safe Haven program in British Columbia. We have webinars like this one. We've already done, this is our third one this fiscal year, and we will be doing one more in March. We have statistical fact sheets coming out, and we've already released one online toolkit on the refugee claim process. That one we did in partnership with MAP BC, and we have one more coming out soon this month on work permits and job search. We're also excited to have VAST working with us to provide in-person training sessions in 5 different locations across British Columbia. We've already reached out to everyone by email to register, but I'll also post the registration information in the chat box just in case you didn't get it. And you can register for those sessions as well. With that will come an e-learning and also a toolkit as well that'll be released a little bit later on. And we'll also be doing a mental health environmental scan that we've been doing with actually Mona, our speaker today. And we will be completing that report by the end of this fiscal year as well. And we also have a mapping of refugee claimant service providers that'll also be available on the BC Refugee Hub as well. So there's a lot coming soon. I did want to highlight our BC Safe Haven service directory. We released the first one in fall of last year, and then we released a second edition early January, and then we will be doing one more update and releasing in March. So the idea is that it's constantly being updated so that the information in the service directory is always the latest and most up to date. And we also have weekly and monthly activities. So we have our weekly posts on the hub, monthly e-newsletters, and then we also participate in regular collaboration meetings with the BC Resource Network partners who are VAST, MAP BC, AMSA, and others as well. And we'll also be participating in working groups so that we're always up to date on what the sector is looking for in terms of capacity building resources and tools that we can post on the BC Refugee Hub. If you have anything that you'd like posted on the hub, you can email me at refugeehub@issbc.org, and we'll put it on our newsletter and on the hub as well. So I'd now like to introduce Kieran Davis, who's the program specialist with the BC Safe Haven Resource Network at AMSA.
Thank you, Bahar. On our next slide, I just want to do a brief land acknowledgement. As a provincial umbrella association, AMSA acknowledges that BC is on the unceded homelands of First Nations who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. We recognize the privilege that we have as settlers on this land and acknowledge that AMSA's operations are on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As an organization, AMSA is committed to creating a safe space for Indigenous voices. The Safe Haven program provides key supports to refugee claimants and other humanitarian and vulnerable newcomers. The Safe Haven Resource Network is a collaboration and partnership-focused program supporting direct service providers through targeted capacity building activities. This collaboration includes multiple partner organizations who play a key role in creating resources for direct service providers. And on our next slide, you can see the partners who are part of the resource network and the different streams that those partners work with us on. So capacity building activities include webinars like this one, fact sheets, and many other resources, as well as supporting organizations to develop humanitarian movement response plans. Mental health stream activities Bahar described several of include workshops, e-learning, information sessions, and a phone line for frontline service providers to get support as they work with vulnerable newcomers. Our language activities include consultation with lead Safe Haven contract organizations to create a curriculum for Safe Haven language instruction that is specific to the real-world language needs and classroom needs of refugee claimants. And then through AMSA's charitable arm ACES, we work with United Way on public support gathering to build community support for refugee claimants and other humanitarian newcomers, including public awareness, donations, volunteering, and other community-based supports. And on our next slide, we just have the contact information to follow AMSA on social media on X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And please visit our website, amsa.org, in order to find other resources and tools and recorded webinars and a variety of reports and other resources that may be valuable to you in your work. Thank you.
Thanks, Kieran. I will now introduce our speaker, Mona. Mona Hassannia has over 15 years of frontline and management experience in the BC settlement and integration sector, working with various populations, including government-assisted refugees, refugee claimants, migrants, and immigrants. She is also a registered clinical counselor, bringing this experience into her role in her work as a mental health consultant and an accomplished trainer, developing toolkits, training, and curriculum to strengthen the field. Over to you, Mona.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Welcome today. Today, we're going to be talking about addressing emotional challenges during uncertainty and focusing primarily on refugee claimants, as Bahar had mentioned. I, too, would like to make a quick land acknowledgement and gratefully acknowledge and honor that the land on which I am presenting on from today is the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As a trauma counselor and understanding the depths of intergenerational trauma, doing a land acknowledgement is a very minimal way of that I allow myself to really kind of acknowledge and form an allyship for our Indigenous populations. I think when we start to talk about refugee claimants and we talk about some of the emotional challenges, we have to have a context and a framework of what trauma means and how it is connected. So, you know, there's a lot of variety of definitions for trauma, but really when it comes down to is that trauma comes from experiences that really overwhelm us and our capacity to cope with something. Right? We all have stressors. There's stressful things that kind of go on in our lives, but trauma is kind of beyond that. It is a situation where we are not able to cope. It can result from many, many things, accidents, natural disasters, childhood abuse and neglect, sexualized violence, even witnessing acts of violence, sudden loss, war, intergenerational trauma, historical acts such as genocide, colonialism. These are all, you know, examples of what trauma can look like. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that the person's perception here is quite important of a traumatic event. And it really greatly actually impacts and affects how their mind and body react to trauma. And this is what makes traumatic events actually difficult to define because trauma affects people in different ways. What may be traumatizing for you might not be traumatizing for me, and vice versa. So the same event may be much more traumatic for one person than the other. And that doesn't have to do with particularly internal coping skills. There's a variety of external features that impact that. So it's not about the individual and not being strong enough. It's really about how it impacts based on a lot of different factors for that person. And so when we think about trauma and the process of traumatization, you know, a traumatic event is any situation where you feel that your sense of safety, the foundational sense of safety and your sense of self is in question, is going to be harmed, right? There is something there that is going to really kind of uh, create instability around that. And so what happens is that at that traumatic event, there's an interpretation of that event, right? We have our reptilian brain, which is the amygdala at the back of our heads, and that brain asks, is this dangerous for me? Am I in danger? Right? And so if the answer, if the response is yes, then there's a whole slew of events that happens in your brain and your body, right? And this is where we talk about kind of the stress response. This is where we talk about kind of the survival, fight and flight, and sometimes in extreme situations, freeze, where we have no coping skills to be able to make a next move. And so this process of traumatization is really about the interpretation of that event. And again, kind of can be quite different. We know that the impacts of trauma are very deep. And so when we talk about refugee claimants and some of the pre-migration and during migration and post-migration struggles really do add on to the stressors of and impacts of trauma. I want you to think about trauma in a way that when you have your stress response on at all times. So think about this. When you have a stressful situation happen, right, there's almost like a increase, right, in cortisol. You're really kind of, your muscles are tense. There's a whole lot of things that happens in your brain and your functioning. And then after the stressful situation, you kind of go back to your baseline. Now, with trauma, that doesn't happen. You're not going back to your baseline. You're actually on all the time. There's almost like an alarm clock, alarm bell going on in your brain where you are in a very reactive state. Bessel van der Kolk, who is one of the foremost speakers and neuroscientist who's written the book, The Body Keeps Score, he has a short clip in his book that says, after trauma, the world is experienced with a different nervous system. The survivor's energy now becomes focused on suppressing inner chaos at the expense of spontaneous involvement in their lives. These attempts to maintain control over unbearable physiological reactions can result in a whole range of physical symptoms. This explains why it's critical for trauma treatment to engage the entire organism, body, mind, and brain. So again, he's really speaking around this fact that your body is taken over with that. So you have fragmented memory, there's constant state of fear and anxiety, there's difficulty to concentrate. When refugee claimants come and say, I have such a hard time learning the language, right? It's because there's shifts that have been happening in the brain and connected to difficulties in concentration. Judgment and perception is quite off, and it's very difficult to form or keep attachments and relationship, right? Because think about it. If you are having such a hard time regulating what is happening internally inside of you, it becomes very hard to regulate and manage what's happening externally. And so again, what is really clear about a traumatic event is that it harms a person's sense of safety, their sense of self, and their ability to regulate emotions and navigate relationships. Now, again, this is an important kind of context to what we're talking about today in terms of uncertainty, because as we know, refugee claimants have a higher level of traumatic events that have happened. Again, both think of it in terms of pre-migration, during migration, and post-migration. Now, how does anxiety fit into all this? Well, anxiety is a constant state of worry, right? And we all have it, right? Again, going back to that place in our brain, the amygdala, anxiety is what tells us, hey, don't cross the street when there's so much traffic coming on, right? Because there's a fear, there's a sense of I'm going to harm myself, right? What is interesting and important to, I think, note about anxiety is that it comes from uncertainty and it can be a perceived threat, right? So it doesn't mean that the threat needs to be real for us to feel all that we feel in terms of anxiety, but that it can also be a perceived feeling. And so for refugee claimants, this anxiety is obviously very much amplified by these long waits that are completely unpredictable in terms of the waiting periods. And so it harms their feelings of safety and it harms their sense of security, right? So going back to, again, some of those pieces of trauma that we were talking about. I think the stress of those prolonged uncertainties take a very, very serious toll on anyone's mental, emotional, and physical well-being. And so these concepts of, the fear of deportation, what will that look like? What will happen? Navigating really complex systems such as the legal system, not understanding or having inconsistent policies in immigration laws, worrying about returning to unsafe situations or conditions. How will the decision impact their family members, both in Canada and back home, right? There is a lot of anxiety that is kind of fueled through this process. And we'll talk a little bit more on how to kind of assist clients in dealing with that. Anticipatory grief. I'm not sure if anybody has heard about that term. Anticipatory grief refers to kind of this emotional and psychological response that happens when somebody is fearing or facing a potential loss of something that's quite meaningful for them, right? So unlike traditional grief, which actually follows after an event, right? So there's an event that happened, for example, the death of a loved one, right? And then we grieve that individual. Anticipatory grief is kind of this ongoing situation where it's not resolved, but we feel it's coming, and it makes it more complex to navigate. And there's examples of that. It includes loss of homeland and cultural identity, uncertainty about legal status and future safety, separation from family and community, the fear of rejection, deportation, loss of professional identity and career aspiration. These are just some examples, right? And I'm sure working as frontline workers, there's ample examples in terms of how anticipatory grief demonstrates. What does that look like? Well, the impacts of anticipatory grief are persistent anxiety, consistently worrying about the future, What if there's negative outcomes, right? Anxiety consistently asks the what if question, right? And it's never, what if I win the lottery, right? It's what if I get deported? What if I can't put food on the table because I can't find employment? It's all of these negative outcomes that are increasing those fears. Depression and hopelessness, feeling powerless over the legal process. There is very limited places where there is a sense of control, right? Your faith is essentially in somebody else's hands, right, to make a decision. Feelings of guilt and shame, especially for those who the person has kind of left behind. This is connected to feelings of irritability and anger as well. So directed at systems, at oneself. I'm sure as frontline workers, and I speak from experience, you've probably experienced that, right? Whereas that frustration, that feeling of helplessness. And that can sometimes lead to isolation and withdrawal, really kind of feeling detached or avoiding discussions about the future, right? Because it's hard to kind of manage and handle. The long waiting periods for refugee hearings and decisions can be a really kind of time of significant emotional distress, as I'm sure many of you understand. And this is particularly due to feelings of anticipatory grief. So again, grieving the loss that very much might come, as well as anxiety of fear of this uncertain outcome. And so we talk about kind of the potential loss of status, the safety, the ability to kind of remain in the country. All of these things are themes that are consistently going on and impacting while the person is waiting for an answer. Separation from family members, the loss of identity, home, and professional roles in their home country. Facing uncertainty about the future, the feelings of deportation, rejection, struggling with finding employment, housing, and financial stability. Right? All of these things kind of attribute to feeling both severe amounts of anxiety as well as anticipatory grief. So the question comes, well, how are these two really kind of different, right? So remember, anxiety is more of a generalized feeling of worry and fear, right? Everybody has anxiety. We just have it at different degrees at different times, right? If we didn't, the human race would probably end. Anticipatory grief is a form of mourning, right? There is an anticipation for a loss, and we are mourning that loss as it's unraveling, right? So not after it, but as it's unraveling. And the root cause of anticipatory grief is the expectation of a significant loss, right? So we know that this we're expecting it. This is coming about. Whereas with anxiety, we don't really, it's unknown, it's unpredictable. We think it will happen, but we're not sure. And there's a real sense of this lack of control. Often with anxiety, it's not necessarily specific, it's more of a generalized feeling. And it's focused on all the different potential negative outcomes, right? With anticipatory grief, it's very specific. And there are losses that are connected to it. And there's almost an emotional preparation, thinking that if we prepare ourselves emotionally, the impact will be less. And so symptoms that come from anxiety, restlessness, racing thoughts, muscle tensions, right? Because we're so enclosed all the time, difficulty concentrating, excessive worry. With anticipatory grief, it's much more around sadness, this emotional numbness, detachment. There's like a preoccupation with loss and a sense of mourning something. And I think the best way to kind of describe that is that when we talk about anxiety, it's very much future oriented, right? We're talking about what might happen. When we're talking about anticipatory grief, yes, we're talking about future focus, but it's also very much connected to the current and past grief, right? So in terms of that time, we're not only thinking about the future, but we are thinking about also what we're missing now and what we've missed in the past as well. So you can see that there's almost a heaviness or a sadness very much connected to that. And so it makes sense that there's a feeling of sorrow. There's a feeling of sadness. It's very much sorrow driven. Whereas with anxiety, it's fear driven. And sometimes with anxiety, we either try to completely avoid it or we become really hypervigilant about it. We constantly want somebody to reassure us, right? So again, thinking in terms of your roles, right? Asking the same question several times, right? Almost wanting to be reassured in some way. With anticipatory grief, it's the emotional processing. How do I seek closure? How do I make sense of this, right? How do I connect to have empathy around it? How does this all connect? Well, again, trauma is past experiences, and it leads to potential situations where there's hypervigilance, fear, emotional distress. Anticipatory grief, again, the mourning of potential future losses. This overlaps with trauma by triggering past experiences and involves sadness, detachment, emotional withdrawal. Anxiety, again, is that persistent fear, right? That ongoing fear, sense of fear or worry about kind of what's happening in uncertain future. It's intensified by both trauma and anticipatory grief and leads to this idea of rumination and panic and sometimes avoiding certain behavior. And the interconnection is that trauma exacerbates anticipatory grief and anxiety, while both feed into trauma responses, creating this cycle of almost distress for the individual. When we are talking about trauma-informed lens, we are talking about understanding trauma. We're talking about, instead of asking what is wrong with this client, we begin to start asking questions like, what happened to this client, right? To be able to meet the client where they're at. The 6 principles of trauma-informed care is an approach that was created by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And this provides a really good guide to settlement practitioners and any frontline workers working with individuals who have experienced past traumas. And so it looks at 6 key aspects: creating safety, right? Ensuring that your interactions are both in terms of physical and emotional safety. Trustworthiness and transparency, increasing trust by making tasks and boundaries really clear. Peer support. Peer support is a form of kind of self-help and notion of services that are offered to be able to provide safety and hope, because you're seeing your peers who have kind of gone past that, which makes it much more impactful in a positive way. Collaboration and mutuality, so partnership and leveling and understanding power dynamics. Empowerment, voice, and choice. This is so important when working with refugee claimants, especially because you're promoting independence, you're promoting autonomy every chance that you get. It's a very client-centered approach where the client knows best and the client decides and the client has a voice. Because again, think about those feelings of hopelessness or helplessness, those feelings of not being in control. And so really important to practice that at any opportunity. Cultural, historic, and gender issues. Services that are offered need to be sensitive to gender, culture, and the unique background of the client for it to be a trauma-informed care. So what does that actually look like when we're applying these things? A trauma-informed approach really ensures that refugee claimants kind of feel safe, they feel empowered, and they feel supported during this period of uncertainty. And that starts with communication. So keeping claimants informed about the process, about the expected timelines, about the available support, making it really predictable in terms of some regular check-ins, some structured support programs, and any access to any legal or mental health resources that are available that can help kind of this notion of uncertainty for them. That the care is culturally responsive, meaning that you're offering services in multiple language whenever available, or you provide community-based resources that kind of reflect their cultural background or resonate for them. There's clarity and clarifying the legal process. So being able to provide clear step-by-step information about what they can expect, about the hearings, about the decisions. And this knowledge and this information can alleviate a lot of the uncertainty about what they're getting into, right? Because now they're a bit more empowered by that information, knowing what's coming next. Building trusting relationship, that rapport between you as service providers that foster so much trust, being consistent, being reliable, being transparent, all of these really impact that relationship. Peer support networks, again, connecting claimants with others who are facing either similar situations. It can reduce isolation and provide kind of that mutual encouragement. One of the examples, of a great a great program is with FAST, right? And their group, where kind of claimants get information, but also have that peer support network that they can rely on. Community gatherings and rituals, are there culturally or faith-based gatherings that can kind of help and maintain a sense of identity, a sense of belonging to help the refugee claimant if they want to continue to be part of that community? I think that's a really key part as well. Mindfulness and breathing exercises, anything that kind of helps them to, again, reduce some of those panic or intrusive thoughts that may come up for them. There's been a lot of work now done on expressive therapies or activities for refugee claimants, so around art, music, journaling, whether that's in groups or just for themselves, right? To be able to process some of their emotions, to be able to manage their grief. Trauma-informed counseling, the access to mental health professionals who are actually trained in refugee trauma and can provide some coping strategies or validations. Encouraging personal agency. I can't stress this enough in terms of allowing claimants to kind of make their own choices in the settlement process, even if sometimes that goes against kind of what your personal ideas are and what would be best for that. So again, really very much placing that individual in the center. And strength-based approaches. Highlighting resilience, I think, for refugee claimants is critical. Because most of the time they're used to hearing stories about, their struggles and their traumas. And it's really, really important to be able to highlight some of those pieces where they have done something and they have demonstrated resilience and they have used their survival skills, which again, we know is very much apparent within refugee claimants. So being able to kind of attribute and acknowledge some of those pieces. What does that actually look like when you're sitting and doing that across your desk? Well, settlement and legal support. Giving updates as much as possible, right? Because this, we know that does reduce fear of the unknown. It does kind of feel like, okay, I'm a bit more empowered because I know what's happening. I know some of the next steps as much as possible. Mental health support. Are there trauma-informed counseling and peer groups that the person can be kind of led to, right? This provides a lot of emotional validation through such groups. Encourage stress reduction. Again, within the cultural context, like what does that look like? Whether it's exercising, whether it's meditation, whether it's taking a walk in nature, all of these things we know are evidence-based ways to help manage anxiety and distress. Getting them to create some sort of routine and structure during their daily lives really kind of helps to create some predictability and control in a situation where otherwise it might not be felt. Social support. So again, back to the idea of community center events, faith groups, social networks to reduce some of the feelings of isolation and strengthen that sense of identity. And skill building and education, right? Language classes, employment programs, all of these things, again, enhance agency and increase confidence for that individual. We know that frontline workers play a critical role in mitigating some of the anxieties and anticipatory griefs for refugee claimants. And I think, as we've kind of seen in terms of the 6 principles of trauma-informed care, providing that kind of compassionate, stable environment, being able to interact, knowing that, we can acknowledge some of the fear or grief without re-traumatizing the client. being able to access and help access some of the services such as housing, food security, employment resources. Whenever possible, advocating for systemic change that improves client support services, right? So advocating for your clients, educating clients on emotional resilience and coping tools. What does that look like, within your culture? Well, here's some ideas. What can we do around that? And connecting individuals with culturally relevant resources and community networks. I think, again, many refugee claimants feel that sense of isolation. They've left their village back home, the imaginary village of having that social capital, of having, a lot of people around them, to feeling quite isolated. And so anytime we can connect them with community networks and resources, I think it's a very positive impact. Again, as frontline workers, it's so important to build safety with clients. This is because clients who have experienced trauma or ongoing through a situation of an anticipatory grief or anxiety, they have this base expectation that the world is a dangerous place. And as a result, they are quite reactive in terms of their self-defense mode, right? They need to protect themselves around that. And so it's really, really key in a first step to be able to build that connection, that safety. One of the things that I would highlight the most is we want to make sure to regulate first. I think, one of the most critical things that frontline workers provide for refugee claimants is information, right? But information is not very possible when the person is not regulated, right? If the client is very, very distressed and you're trying to tell them about some English class that they should be taking, that information isn't being registered, right? So we got to be able to regulate first, educate later. The ability to kind of validate some of their emotions, to be able to say, yeah, I get it. This is a really, really tough situation. This is really hard. And sometimes that ability to be able to show compassion, to be able to create that safety, allows them to help them to regulate, right? And then we can begin to kind of inform them about the resources and the abilities to educate them as well. I think we talk a lot about self-care, especially in your roles as settlement practitioners or frontline workers in the helping profession, which means that you are consistently supporting others, sometimes through very extremely difficult situations. And so it is important that you also take care of yourselves, right? I think one of the surest ways to build resentment in any situation, and especially so as frontline workers, as well as burnout, is to practice compassion without setting those boundaries in our work, right? So this icon is kind of a helpful reminder to say that a gentle reminder to say to take care of yourself work as well while you're taking care of others. At a certain point, as a mental health practitioner, I stopped using the word self-care because people were just rolling their eyes. And instead I used self-preservation, right? This idea to also preserving myself as I'm doing the work that I'm doing to be able to continue to do it.
Thanks, Mona. Thank you for your presentation. I think this is a topic that really specifically relates to refugee claimants, like anticipatory grief, especially because there's sometimes a 2-year wait period between the time someone makes a claim and the time they get a response. So it's a lot for a person to deal with and to take in. So I just wanted to thank everyone who's joining us today. Thank you for joining to learn more, to build your capacity, and your continued work with refugees and refugee claimants. Your work is important and impactful. So thank you all. We'd also like to thank the province of British Columbia for your continued support and funding for the BC Refugee Hub and training sessions like this one. Make sure you're registered or you've signed up for our e-newsletter, and you can do that by going to bcrefugeehub.ca. And if you just go to the very bottom, you just put in your email address and you'll be added to our e-newsletter list. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mona. Thanks, Kieran, for giving us information about the BC Safe Haven Resource Network. And thank you all for joining us.